What if I told you that one small step in Florida changed humanity forever, but the real story of what happened that year could have ended in absolute catastrophe? The year was 1969, and Florida stood at the crossroads of destiny, danger, and dreams that seemed impossible. While the world watched the skies, few understood the razor's edge upon which everything balanced, or the secrets that lurked in the swamps, the streets, and the very soil of the Sunshine State. The countdown begins. The air hung thick and heavy over Cape Kennedy that January morning, laden with salt spray from the Atlantic and something else, something electric, almost supernatural. Dr. Margaret Chen wiped the condensation from her observation window at Launch Complex 39, her breath fogging the glass despite the air conditioning that hummed relentlessly through the concrete bunker. 30 seconds to ignition. The voice crackled through the speakers, flat and emotionless, as if announcing a bus schedule rather than mankind's audacious leap toward the moon. But Margaret knew better. She'd spent 3 sleepless nights reviewing the calculations, double-checking the fuel mixture ratios, examining every photograph of the Saturn V rocket that towered 11 stories above the Florida marshland, and she'd found something: a hairline fracture in one of the fuel line connectors, visible only in the high-resolution images she'd demanded after her suspicions grew too loud to ignore. She'd reported it. Of course she had. But the response from Mission Control had been swift and dismissive. Acceptable tolerance. Launch proceeds as scheduled. Now, as she watched the smoke begin to billow from the base of Apollo 9, her stomach twisted into knots. This wasn't the moonshot that would come later, but it was the crucial test. The dress rehearsal that would prove whether the lunar module could actually work in space. If this failed, the whole program failed, and if her fears were correct. 10, 9, 8. The ground began to tremble. Through the reinforced glass, she watched as the rocket seemed to hesitate, as though the machine itself questioned the wisdom of what it was about to attempt. Then, with a roar that shook her bones and rattled her teeth, Apollo 9 lifted off. The flame was beautiful and terrible column of controlled violence that turned night into day, that made the birds flee from the mangroves for miles around. Margaret pressed her hands against the window, willing the spacecraft upward, silently begging the universe to prove her wrong. 1 second, 2, 5, 10. The rocket climbed, clean and true, punching through the thin morning clouds. In the control room behind her, she heard the eruption of cheers and applause. But Margaret didn't celebrate. She couldn't, not yet. The real test would come in orbit, when astronauts James McDivitt, David Scott, and Russell Schweickart separated the lunar module from the command module for the first time. Not yet, but soon. Secrets in the swamp, 300 miles south. In the dense shadows of the Everglades, another kind of tension was building. Carlos Mendoza crouched low in the sawgrass, his hand resting on the cool metal of his .38 revolver. The airboat engine had died 20 minutes ago sabotaged. He was certain leaving him and his partner stranded in a labyrinth of channels and cypress knees, where the water looked black as oil and twice as deadly. "You hear that?" whispered Tommy Rodriguez, his eyes wide in the darkness. Carlos heard it. The low rumble of engines, multiple boats converging from different directions. This was supposed to be a simple surveillance operation, monitoring suspected drug smuggling routes through the national park. But simple had died the moment they'd spotted the warehouse. The warehouse that shouldn't exist. The warehouse that appeared on no maps, situated on a hammock island that the official surveys claimed was uninhabited. The warehouse where they'd watched, through binoculars in the fading light, as men in military fatigues unloaded crates marked with symbols Carlos didn't recognize. He'd radioed it in, requested backup. But the response had been strange. A long pause, then a curt order to withdraw immediately and file a report in the morning. When Carlos had pressed for an explanation, the line had gone dead. Now those boats were hunting them. "We need to move," Carlos breathed, already beginning to low-crawl through the marsh grass. The water soaked through his clothes, cold and rank with decomposition. Something brushed against his leg, a gator, probably, or a water moccasin, but he forced himself not to react. The men in the boats were a more immediate danger than anything nature could throw at him. Behind them, a searchlight suddenly blazed to life, sweeping across the marsh in a wide arc. Carlos and Tommy froze, pressing themselves flat into the mud. The light passed overhead, so bright that Carlos could see the tiny insects dancing in its beam. Could see Tommy's face painted with terror and muck. "Federal agents," a voice boomed across the water. "You are trespassing in a restricted area. Surrender immediately." Federal agents. Carlos's mind raced. He was a federal agent D, assigned to the Miami field office. What the hell was happening? The searchlight swept back, slower this time, methodical. In 20 seconds, maybe 30, it would find them. Carlos made a decision. "On 3, we run for the tree line. Don't stop for anything. Carlos, man, we can't." 1. Another searchlight joined the first, cutting through the darkness from a different angle. 2. Tommy's breathing had become ragged, panicked. Carlos could smell the fear coming off him in waves. 3. They burst from the sawgrass like startled deer, churning through knee-deep water toward the dark wall of mangroves 100 yards distant. The searchlights found them instantly, and the night exploded with a sharp crack of rifle fire. Water geysered around Carlos's feet. A bullet hissed past his ear, so close he felt its wake. Tommy screamed, hit, or just terrified. Carlos couldn't tell, but kept running. 50 yards. 40. More boats roared to life, engines screaming as they gave chase. But the mangroves were close now, almost close enough to touch. If they could just reach the trees, the twisted roots and overlapping branches would provide cover, would slow the boats. 20 yards. Carlos's lungs burned. His legs felt like lead. A deadly percussion that chewed up the water and the mud and the vegetation all around them. 10 yards. Tommy went down. Carlos didn't think. Tommy's leg was bleeding, a dark stain spreading through his pants, but he could still move. They crashed into the mangrove forest together, branches whipping their faces, roots threatening to trip them with every step. But the boats couldn't follow here, not into this maze of twisted wood and shallow water. Carlos pulled Tommy deeper into the forest, away from the lights and the shouts and the fury of their pursuers. And as they ran, he couldn't shake the image from his mind. Those crates in the warehouse, unmarked and sinister, being loaded with military precision under the Florida moon. What the hell had they stumbled onto? The mission back at Camp Kennedy. The days ticked by with agonizing slowness. Margaret Chen watched the Apollo 9 mission unfold from the ground, monitoring every transmission, every piece of telemetry data. The crew had successfully separated the lunar module, nicknamed Spider, from the command module, Gumdrop, and for 6 hours they'd flown the vehicles independently in Earth's orbit. It had worked against all her fears. It had worked beautifully. But Margaret's relief was short-lived. On March 13th, as the crew prepared for re-entry, she noticed something in the data stream, a pressure fluctuation in one of the fuel lines. Tiny, almost imperceptible, but there and growing. "We need to abort the re-entry burn," she said, her voice cutting through the controlled chaos of the room. "There's a pressure anomaly in fuel line 3. Flight Director Gene Kranz turned to her, his face carved from granite. "Dr. Chen, we've reviewed that data. The fluctuation is within acceptable parameters. It's building," she insisted, pointing to her calculations. "If it continues at this rate, we'll have a rupture during the burn in the upper atmosphere. They'll have no way to—" "We're committed to the flight plan," Kranz interrupted. "The crew has already begun their pre-burn checklist." Margaret felt the room spinning. She'd been through this before: the dismissal, the condescension, the assumption that because she was young, because she was a woman, because she was Chinese American in a room full of white men, she must be overreacting. But this time, lives hung in the balance. "Gene, please, just delay the burn by 1 orbit. Give me time to negative. We burn on schedule." Margaret stood there, frozen, as the room continued its well-choreographed dance around her. On the main screen, she could see the live feed from the spacecraft. Astronaut James McDivitt's voice crackled through the speakers. "Houston, we are go for re-entry, burn." "Roger that, Apollo 9. You are go for re-entry." Margaret closed her eyes. She'd done everything she could. If she was wrong, she'd probably never work in the space program again. But if she was right, the seconds crawled by. The burn began. The pressure readings flickered on her monitor, rising, rising. Then, suddenly, miraculously, stabilizing. The crew splashed down safely in the Atlantic, just east of Nassau, exactly as planned. The mission was hailed as a complete success, a crucial step toward the ultimate goal of landing on the moon. Margaret should have felt vindicated. Instead, she felt exhausted and, strangely, more uncertain than ever. Had she been wrong? Or had they simply gotten lucky? That night, alone in her apartment near Cocoa Beach, she received a phone call. No greeting, just a voicemail, middle-aged, with an accent she couldn't quite place. "Dr. Chen, you asked the right questions today. Keep asking them, but be careful. There are people who don't want certain things to be questioned." "Who is this?" she demanded. "A friend. Or perhaps just someone who understands what you're up against." When Apollo 11 launches this summer, make sure you're watching. And not just the rocket. The line went dead. Margaret sat in the darkness, the phone still pressed to her ear, wondering what fresh nightmare she'd stumbled into. The perfect crime in Miami. The temperature soared as spring turned toward summer. The city pulsed with a different kind of energy than the Space Coast here. The tension was earthier, more dangerous. Money flowed through the streets like the tide. And with it came violence, corruption, and secrets that festered in the tropical heat. Carlos Mendoza had spent 2 months trying to forget what he'd seen in the Everglades. His superiors had dismissed his report, claimed he'd misidentified a legitimate military installation, suggested that the stress of the job might be getting to him. Tommy Rodriguez had been transferred to the San Diego office for his own safety, they'd said, though Carlos suspected it was really to silence him. But Carlos couldn't let it go. In his spare time, he'd been digging, following threads that seemed to lead nowhere, asking questions that made people uncomfortable. He'd learned that the area where they'd found the warehouse had been designated as a special operations zone in 1967. Though the designation was buried so deep in classified documents that it took him weeks to find even that much. He'd also learned that several other federal agents who'd asked similar questions had suffered unfortunate accidents. A car crash on the Tamiami Trail, A boating incident in the Keys. A sudden heart attack at age 34. Carlos had started sleeping with his revolver under his pillow. On a sweltering night in late June, Carlos sat in his car outside a dive bar in Liberty City, watching the entrance. He was waiting for a man named Eugene Thornton, a former CIA operative who'd allegedly worked in Southeast Asia during the early 60s. According to Carlos's source, a paranoid ex-Marine who lived in a trailer park and collected conspiracy theories the way other people collected stamps. Thornton had been reassigned to Florida in 1967, around the same time that the Special Operations Zone had been created. The connection was tenuous at best, but it was all Carlos had. At 11:47 p.m., Thornton emerged from the bar, walking with the careful precision of a man who'd had exactly 3 drinks, enough to loosen his tongue, not enough to impair his judgment. Carlos waited until Thornton was fumbling with his car keys, then approached from the shadows. Eugene Thornton. The man spun, his hand moving instinctively toward his waistband. But when he saw Carlos's D badge, he relaxed slightly, though his eyes remained wary. "Who's asking?" "My name is Carlos Mendoza. I'm D. I need to ask you about some operations in the Everglades." Thornton's face went carefully blank. "I don't know what you're talking about." Special Operations Zone, designated in 67. Unmarked warehouse on an island that doesn't officially exist. Military cargo being moved at night. Ring any bells? For a long moment, Thornton just stared at him. Then, quietly, "Get in my car." Carlos hesitated. Every instinct screamed that this was a trap. But he'd come this far. He climbed into the passenger seat of Thornton's beat-up Chevrolet. They drove in silence for 20 minutes, winding through darkened neighborhoods until they reached Bayfront Park. Deserted at this hour, except for a few homeless people sleeping on benches. Thornton parked near the water and lit a cigarette, the flare of the match briefly illuminating his weathered face. "What I'm about to tell you," he said finally, "could get us both killed. Understand?" Carlos nodded. "The warehouse you found isn't about drugs. It's about weapons. Specifically, weapons that are being stockpiled in preparations in Central America. There are people in the government, powerful people, who believe that Cuba is just the beginning. That we need to establish a network of bases, supply lines, and friendly regimes throughout the region. And Florida is the staging ground for all of it." "That's insane," Carlos breathed. "We can't just, can't we?" Thornton took a long drag on his cigarette. "We've been doing it for years. Guatemala, Nicaragua, Chile. Why not continue? The warehouse you found is one of dozens scattered throughout South Florida. Most of them are run by contractors, ex-military, people who don't officially exist. And the whole operation is funded by, let's call them, creative revenue streams. You mean drug money. Among other things. Carlos felt sick. Why are you telling me this? Thornton was quiet for a moment, staring out at the black water of Biscayne Bay. Because I'm tired, Agent Mendoza. Tired of the lies, the bodies, the endless cycle of violence in service of geopolitical chess games. And because I think you're one of the good ones. One of the people who still believes the system can work. Can it? I don't know anymore. Thornton flicked his cigarette out the window. But I do know this. In 2 weeks, there's going to be a major shipment moving through that warehouse. Enough weapons to outfit a small army. If you want proof, if you want to blow this thing wide open, that's your chance. But you'll need help, official help, people higher up the chain than you or me. Who? Thornton reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. This is a name. A senator on the Intelligence Committee. He's been asking questions too. He might listen. Or he might have you killed. Honestly, it's 50-50 at this point. Carlos took the paper, hands trembling slightly. Why not go to him yourself? Because I'm a drunk ex-spook with no credibility and a lot of enemies. You're a decorated federal agent with a clean record. You've got a chance. Thornton started the engine. Now get out of my car before someone sees us together. As Carlos walked back toward his own vehicle. The Miami night felt heavier than ever, pressing down on his shoulders like a physical weight. He had 2 weeks to decide whether he was brave enough or foolish enough to follow this through to the end. 2 weeks until everything either came together or fell catastrophically apart. One small step, the world held its breath. Margaret Chen stood in the VIP observation area at Cape Kennedy on July 16th. Surrounded by politicians, celebrities, and journalists who'd come from around the globe to witness history. But her attention wasn't on the spectacle, the cameras, or the excited chatter. Her eyes were locked on the Saturn V rocket that held Apollo 11 and its crew, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. Somewhere inside that towering machine were 3 men about to attempt something that had never been done. Something that most people thought impossible until a few years ago. If they succeeded, they would land on the moon. If they failed, Margaret had spent the past 4 months obsessively reviewing every system, every calculation, every possible failure mode. She'd made herself unpopular with her colleagues, earned a reputation as paranoid and difficult, but she didn't care. She'd become convinced that something wasn't right about the Apollo program. It wasn't sabotage, exactly. The rockets were sound, the calculations correct, but there was desperation to it all. A sense that they were racing against more than just the Soviets, more than just the end of the decade deadline set by President Kennedy. They were racing against something else, something nobody would talk about openly. The countdown reached 0. The earth shook. The sky turned to fire. And Apollo 11 climbed toward the heavens on a pillar of flame that seemed to connect the earth to the stars themselves. Margaret watched it disappear into the blue, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to hope. Maybe she'd been wrong. Maybe her paranoia had gotten the better of her. Maybe this really was just what it appeared to be, humanity's greatest adventure. 3 days later, as the world watched on television, Neil Armstrong descended the ladder of the lunar module and stepped onto the surface of the moon. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Margaret watched from her apartment, tears streaming down her face. Whatever her concerns, whatever secrets might lurk in the shadows of the space program, this moment was real. This achievement was genuine. Humanity had reached beyond the cradle of Earth and touched another world. But even as she celebrated, even as she joined the impromptu parties that erupted across Cocoa Beach, a small part of her mind couldn't help but wonder, what had that mysterious caller meant when he'd said to watch not just the rocket? It would be years before she'd learn the answer. Years before documents would be declassified, revealing that the Apollo program had served as cover for the development of reconnaissance satellites, for the establishment of surveillance networks, for a dozen different intelligence operations that piggybacked on the public's fascination with the moon landing. But on that July night in 1969, Margaret Chen chose to believe in the dream. Chose to believe that sometimes, just sometimes, humanity could accomplish something purely for the sake of wonder, exploration, and the boundless potential of the human spirit. The reckoning, while the nation celebrated, Carlos Mendoza prepared for war. He'd taken Thornton's advice and contacted Senator William Hartley, who'd agreed to meet him at a safe house in Fort Lauderdale. The meeting had gone better than expected. Hartley had listened to everything Carlos had to say, reviewed the evidence he'd managed to gather, and made a decision. "We're going to raid that warehouse," the senator had said. "But we're going to do it right. Military police, federal marshals, and enough witnesses to make sure nobody can bury this afterward." Now, on July 24th, the same day, Apollo 11 splashed down in the Pacific. Carlos found himself in the lead boat of a small flotilla heading deep into the Everglades. 20 armed agents, plus a U.S. Army helicopter providing air support. It was the biggest operation Carlos had ever been part of, and his hands shook as he checked his weapon for the third time. "You okay?" asked Agent Sarah Martinez, one of the few people from the Miami office who'd volunteered for this mission after hearing what it was about. "No," Carlos admitted. "But Let's do this, anyway. The warehouse came into view just as the sun was setting, silhouetted against a sky painted in shades of orange and purple. The boats cut their engines, drifting silently through the channels. As they approached from multiple directions, Carlos raised his binoculars. The compound was busy, at least a dozen men moving around the exterior, 2 trucks being loaded with cargo. Thornton had been right about the timing. The raid happened fast. The helicopter roared in from the west, searchlight blazing, while the boats converged from all sides. Over loudspeakers, a voice boomed. Federal agents. This facility is surrounded. Put down your weapons and surrender. For a moment, everything froze. Then chaos erupted. The men at the warehouse didn't surrender. Instead, they scattered, some diving for cover, others returning fire with automatic weapons that lit up the gathering darkness. The helicopter banged hard as tracers streaked past it. Carlos and his team hit the dock running, using the trucks and cargo containers as cover. The firefight lasted less than 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. When it was over, 3 suspects were dead, 7 wounded, and the rest in custody. 2 federal agents had been hit, but their vests had saved them. The warehouse. Carlos walked through the facility in a daze, trying to process what he was seeing. Crates upon crates of military hardware, assault rifles, rocket launchers, grenades, even plastic explosives. Enough firepower to start a small war. And in the back office, they found documents, shipping manifests, communications records, financial ledgers that implicated dozens of people, including several high-ranking military officers and at least 2 members of Congress. Jesus Christ, Sarah breathed, standing beside him. How deep does this go? Carlos didn't answer. He was staring at one particular manifest, dated just 2 weeks earlier. It detailed a shipment of weapons that had been routed through this facility and then moved to a staging area in Guatemala, where they'd been distributed to anti-communist paramilitary forces. The operation had been codenamed Apollo's Shadow. Someone, somewhere, had thought it was clever to hide a covert war in the shadow of America's greatest peaceful achievement. To use the moon landing as cover for violence and death thousands of miles away. Carlos felt rage building in his chest, hot and fierce, but he channeled it into action. Over the next weeks and months, he would testify before Congress, help build cases against the conspirators, and watch as some, though not all of the people responsible, faced justice. Eugene Thornton would disappear before he could be called to testify. His body found 6 months later in a motel room in New Mexico. An apparent suicide that nobody who knew him believed for a second, but the warehouse was shut down. The operation was exposed, and though the full truth would be buried in classified files for decades, enough light had been shown into the darkness to make a difference. Reflections on a pivotal year. Florida in 1969 was a crucible where dreams and nightmares melded together in the subtropical heat. The same state that launched humanity toward the stars also harbored secrets that threatened the very ideals the space program claimed to represent. Margaret Chen would go on to become one of NASA's most respected engineers, working on the Space Shuttle program and eventually serving as a mentor to a new generation of scientists and dreamers. But she never forgot that mysterious phone call or the nagging sense that even our greatest achievements can be tainted by hidden agendas. Carlos Mendoza received a commendation for his work exposing the weapons smuggling operation, then quietly requested a transfer to the Seattle field office, as far from Florida as he could get while remaining with the D. He'd seen too much, knew too much, and wanted nothing more than to live a normal life. But the nightmares followed him, dreams of searchlights sweeping across black water, of gunfire in the Everglades, of the secrets that still remained buried beneath the mangrove swamps. The moon landing would become the defining moment of 1969, the event that future generations would remember and celebrate. And rightly said, was an achievement without parallel, a moment when humanity transcended its limitations and touched something greater than itself. But for those who'd lived through the rest of that pivotal year, who'd seen what happened in the shadows while the world's eyes were turned skyward, the truth was more complicated. Florida had been the gateway to another world, yes, but it had also been the staging ground for darker ventures. A place where American exceptionalism and American imperialism collided with devastating force. In the end, perhaps that's the real legacy of Florida in 1969. A reminder that history is never as simple as we'd like it to be. That triumph and tragedy walk hand in hand. That the same courage that takes us to the moon can also lead us into moral ambiguity. And that the most important questions are often the ones nobody wants asked. As the decade drew to a close and America prepared to enter the uncertain waters of the 1970s, Florida stood, as it always had, a threshold between the known and unknown, between the possible and impossible, between the light of our highest aspirations and the shadow of our deepest failures. The gateway to another world, indeed.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, like and share.